Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to another edition of the Spurs Chat podcast and another transfer special, this time with very special guest, Ryan Taylor from the Daily Express. Ryan, thanks for joining me. How are you?
I'm all good, thanks, Chris. Thanks very much for giving me the pleasure of coming onto your show. I'm a big fan of that intro right there. It was really flashy.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I want to talk about you. What's it like being a sports journalist and what's it like following Tottenham Hotspur? Because there's always something going on when it's to do with Spurs.
There is. Fortunately, in a way, I don't just cover Spurs, so I'm kind of looking at all the clubs really. But I know there's kind of that running joke within the Spurs fan base about Alistair Gold and, you know, going on holiday and stuff happening with Spurs. So I'm kind of a close follower of that. But in terms of, you know, being a journalist and covering football, you know, that's what I wanted to do since I was a kid. So, you know, I'm very fortunate in many ways, to be honest, to do this for a living. But at the same time, you know, there is kind of stuff, particularly in the transfer window, that comes with it that, you know, can be frustrating in terms of, you know, the fans that get on your back about transfers, and, you know, if you report something then it doesn't quite come off, there is kind of ramifications for that. So yeah, it's all good fun and it's something I really enjoy.
We all love a transfer. We love a bit of transfer gossip. Where's the best place or the best experience you've had so far being a journalist? Best place you've been?
That's probably a tough one, to be honest. In terms of covering an event or a game, I've done Champions League matches. I've done 2 heavyweight world title fights between Anthony Joshua and Usyk at Tottenham, actually, and Dillian White and Tyson Fury. So that's been within the past year. So probably one of those really. But in terms of other stuff that I've experienced, you know, covering sports journalism, I got to play at Juventus' stadium, which was quite an experience actually. So yeah, it's all good fun.
What did you make of the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium and that Joshua fight? Because I'll tell you what, that experience for me, I was actually ringside and looking up at the stadium with everybody. You know, the songs, the atmosphere that night was just simply incredible. What do you think of Tottenham's new stadium?
It's a work of art, isn't it? I think, you know, a lot of people have said it's, you know, the best stadium certainly in English football, but world football. And to be honest, I don't think those kind of suggestions, I don't think you can argue with that. Like you said, you know, that night I was there, I remember the firework display for AJ's ring walk, and it was one of those moments that, you know, until you actually probably leave the venue and look back on it, you don't quite realise how, you know, impressive it was. And, you know, no criticism of Frank Warren and stuff, but it was quite the contrast from the Fury White fight at Wembley, which was kind of a flat atmosphere, to be honest with you. So yeah, I think when I compared the two, it kind of made me realise how special Tottenham Stadium was.
Well, Ryan, you're here to talk about transfers and Tottenham Hotspur, but first of all, before we start, you've just started up your own YouTube channel talking about transfers on a regular basis. How can people find you and how did that come about?
So, to be honest, transfers have always been my thing. It's a niche I kind of fell into quite early during my time in the industry. I've been a sports journalist nearly 4 years now. But, you know, like many football fans, I've always had that passion for transfers. And, you know, even since I was really young, I had a ridiculously good knowledge of all the foreign leagues and stuff. So that's kind of how it got going. And then around about 3 summers ago, I managed to have a story that kind of fell on my lap with Everton signed Jean-Philippe Gbamin from Mainz. He's a midfielder. He hasn't played much, to be honest, due to injuries. But I kind of broke that story, to be honest with you. And the buzz and the kind of excitement I got from that really just kind of paved the way, really, for the transfers. And since then, I've been really hot on it. It's something I've really built upon. And thankfully, at the Express last summer, I was given the chance to to write my own column, Taylor's Tuesday Transfers. And that's how the YouTube channel started, really. I started writing about these stories. I totally kind of understood that, you know, not everyone's about reading articles, and it's particularly in the kind of world we're in at the moment. So I thought I'd do a bit of video as well. So I started that up in January just as a kind of next project. And, you know, my followers and stuff have really started to grow in the past 6 months. So, yeah, I'm keen to just get as much content out there as I can for fans. It's something I enjoy. It's a passion. And yeah, as you mentioned, it's kind of something that I've started recently. So the channel was called Taylor Talks Transfers. It's a work in progress at the moment, to be honest with you. I'm still kind of getting up to date with it and learning what works. It's nothing kind of like your channel, Chris. Like I said, I was really impressed with that intro, but it's kind of me just sat there talking in detail about the stories and the information that I get from sources. So yeah, that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
I've got to admit, I do read a lot of the Daily Express articles, and every time I look at them, it's you writing them. So fair play. Now, firstly, I would love to get your thoughts on Tottenham's transfer business so far, because you covering transfers, you're probably not used to, you know, certainly in the last few years, of Tottenham doing their business early and signing. You know, it seems like we're signing real quality household names this summer.
Yeah, and you know, I kind of argued the toss really with Spurs. I put a tweet out a couple of days ago, just sort of praising that if Spurs managed to get the 6 signings over the line before the South Korea trip, which looks a bit touch and go at the moment with Lenglet and certainly Spence, which is still, you know, not necessarily a guarantee at this moment in time, that if they pulled those 6 signings off, you know, that is, I think that window speaks for itself. And there was a lot of Arsenal fans and stuff, as you get on Twitter, commenting and saying, you know, these players aren't necessarily world beaters. But I think what's important to recognise about Tottenham's business is that they're assembling a team, they're assembling a squad that is going to be capable of competing not only in the Premier League, but in Europe and the cup competitions. And they're not just signing big name individuals like we see with the likes of Manchester United. They're carefully handpicking these players that suit Conte's system. You know, if we look at Richarlison, you know, on paper, it's no guarantee that he starts ahead of Kulusevski, Son or Kane. But actually, when you take into consideration how many games are going to be played across the course of a long season, I think that's the exact kind of signing that's really going to, you know, push Spurs closer towards Manchester City and Liverpool, which we will obviously come on to talk about.
Where do you see Richarlison fitting in, though, Ryan? Because, you know, for me, he's a very versatile forward. He can play on the left, can play on the right, can play through the middle. Where do you think he will play on the pitch for the majority of the time we're going to see him in a Spurs shirt?
It's difficult to say because, as you mentioned, you know, he's a versatile player. But for me, when I saw that Spurs were, you know, closing in on Richarlison, I did kind of raise my eyebrows because, as I just touched upon, you know, stylistically, he doesn't necessarily fit straight in because we've seen him at Everton play off the left like him in Son. Obviously, Harry Kane, we know, is going to be the out-and-out number 9 at Spurs. So unless there's a kind of tactical switch to maybe a 3-4-1-2 with a number 10, but even still, you know, you'd expect Son to play up front with Kane over Richarlison. So it's interesting, but I think the important point really that just does cement why it's a strong acquisition is the fact, you know, the amount of games that are going to be played. And, you know, as we've seen in the past few years, if Harry Kane gets injured, you know, Spurs, to be fair to their credit, have coped quite well without him with the likes of Son and Moura through the middle. But, you know, Richarlison would give them a real, you know, although he's obviously nowhere near the quality of Kane, that's you know, it's still a top quality centre forward that could automatically just fit in. So I think it will just be a case of rotation. I wouldn't be surprised to see him feature on the right, even though it's, you know, not his ideal position. But it just brings options to the table, and I think that's ultimately what Tottenham need.
£25 million for Yves Bissouma, who I believe was probably one of the most underrated midfielders in the last couple of years. Would you agree? Absolutely.
I think you know, you only have to look at his performance against Spurs at the Tottenham HOTSPUR Stadium. I think it was in March when Trossard nicked that late winner. But some of the movement with his feet just to beat the press, and you would never watch Basima and think he's an absolute Rolls Royce, but what he does is just so effective. He glues it all together. He's a very intelligent footballer. He can get from box to box, but he can also sort of dictate from that number 6 role. He's not a quality passer as such, but I think he's still got that eye for a further ball forward. And as I mentioned, he can shift the ball from left to right. And I think, alongside Rodrigo Bentancur, I think that could be a really mouth-watering partnership in there. And, even having players like Pierre-Emile Højbjerg and potentially competing for places within the squad, I think, and Oliver Skip, of course, you can't forget him. I just think it puts Spurs in such great stead moving forward.
Would you expect Ivan Perisic to come in as left wing back?
Yeah, I think I would, to be honest. If Richarlison wasn't signed, then, it would probably point towards him playing further forward as well. And I do still think that will be the case. I do think we'll see Perisic in the front three at times this season, but that wing back role is sort of tailor made for him, really. We saw it into Milan, just how effective he can be. Even at his age, he's got the mobility. And for me, the thing I always think about Ivan Perisic is his productivity. He's always had a real eye for goal. He can create goals. He can cross the ball. He's direct. And, I just think as an absolute no-brainer for Spurs. Even when I first had information, I think it was back in April that Spurs were open to exploring the deal. I just thought it made total sense. Even from a financial perspective, a 2-year contract, I don't think his wages are astronomical, but at the same time, you're adding a world-class operator for, no transfer fee. So I think from that perspective, the perfect kind of player to share the minutes out with Ryan Sessegnon as well.
Ryan, of course, we've signed Fraser Forster as well on a free transfer. Your thoughts on him? Because he's got a lot of European experience as well. I wouldn't expect him to play in the Champions League games, but do you think he will get much time in a Spurs shirt under Conte?
It'll probably just be a case of, obviously, helping provide a strong competition on the training pitch for Lloris. And, sometimes when you have a keeper like Goalie that we saw last summer arrive, with all due respect, he didn't really keep Lloris on his toes, whereas Forster has, regularly been used to competing for the number 1 spot at Southampton with the likes of Alex McCarthy and Angus Gunn. And although, it's clear that Lloris is a different class of goalkeeper to Forster, I think, to share the minutes out in the cup competitions as well, I think he's a very sturdy backup goalkeeper. And if you look across the Premier League, I don't think you'll get too many much better than Forster, to be honest. And I find it quite hard to understand why he hasn't played more over Alex McCarthy, because, whenever I've seen him, he tends to make some unbelievable saves. But whereas McCarthy seems to have a few howlers in him. But ultimately, I think this is one that ticks the homegrown box as well. I just think, once again, it's one that makes so much sense for Spurs.
Right, so that's 4 deals done so far. Are you surprised as a journalist that Spurs have done the business so soon, so early?
I think I am, to be honest with you, because if you look at the past few summers, there's been so many kind of interesting storylines with Spurs. I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was one summer that, did you not make a signing altogether? Or
well, people laugh at this stat because I bring it up on this channel so often. We went 518 days without a signing, and then we signed Jack Clark, who we will talk about later on. But 518 days under Pochettino without a signing.
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry for that evaded my brain there, but it does feel like this is a kind of different era for Tottenham, and this is exactly what Paratici was brought in to do. I know Daniel Levy's been at the heart of the majority of the business, to be fair to him, especially the Richarlison deal, which he thrashed out with Bill Kenwright in London. But Paratici is, as a lot of people talk about, has this spider web of connections that really allows him to explore so many transfers. And I think it was, was it January when you were looking at the likes of Sofian Amrabat and players like that? And I think that, even in that 6-month window, it really does show how far Tottenham have come. And to be honest, I think that's the impact of Antonio Conte, because he's demanding that Tottenham really do, attempt to compete with the best in the Premier League, the likes of Liverpool and and City. But in order to do that, he needs that full backing. And towards the end of the season, it was quite clear that he would demand that. And if he couldn't receive promises and that commitment from the board, then he would probably have considered his future. And I do think, there was no greater show of commitment from the board than to do what they've done in the opening 4 weeks. And, ultimately, from my perspective, I feel like Tottenham have cemented top 4 already for next season. I know that's kind of we don't know what's going to happen. But if you look at a team like United, I'm sure they'll do effective business, but they've just lost 6 players upon the expiry of their contracts. And if you take into consideration just how far off they were last season, in my head, you need to replace them and add 5 or 6 more. But it doesn't look like that will happen. Whereas Tottenham, they've kept the crux of their squad and they're adding quality players that genuinely improve the options in the team. So, I think Spurs will be pushing 3rd upwards, but obviously we don't know what's going to happen. There's still a long time to go in the window.
Ryan, you mentioned the January transfer window. When you go back and the players that you mentioned there who we were being linked with, well, on deadline day, we then eventually signed Kulusevski and Bentancur, and a lot of fans, I had Juventus fans on here. I had an Italian journalist on here who were telling me they were no better than Harry Winks. We just signed 2 duds from Juventus, 2 rejects from Juventus. A number of Spurs fans weren't happy as well. And then, of course, they played extremely well. We got top 4. They were 2 fantastic signings in the end, weren't they? How did you feel at the end of that January window? Did you think that Spurs were going to finish in the top 4, being honest?
I've always fancied Spurs under Conte just because I'm just such a big fan of his, the way he demands the maximum from the team. You never really see a Conte side, although, Tottenham did have a bit of a rut mid-season when there was a few questionable results. You never really see a Conte side sort of go into a point of no return where, they're on their knees. I know it was difficulties at Chelsea and stuff, but I always felt Tottenham were going to get better and stronger under Conte the longer the season went on. But I have to be honest, the Bentancur and Kulusevski deal was at the time, I was much like Spurs supporters. I was a little bit underwhelmed by those, given the players that you'd offloaded in January. There was Ndombele, Giovanni Lo Celso, there's a few others. Brian Hill went on loan to Valencia, and it felt like you were significantly weakening, even the fringe players within the squad and not really adding too much quality. But the impact of both of those players was, off the scale, really, particularly Kulusevski. If you look at his numbers and, even, the quality of some of his goals and assists. I remember the assist against Leicester for Son, I think it was, or I don't know if it was an assist, but the neat work on the touchline, the footwork. And then that goal at Norwich on the final day, I think, if you look at his age, that's a serious prospect there for Spurs. And I think already they're kind of laughing in terms of the value that they're going to make on that signing there. And Bentancur he's just a very steady operator who, in my opinion, he doesn't do anything that's incredibly flash, but what he does do is always so effective. He was affecting the game at both ends of the pitch towards the end of the season. So, over time, I think we've grown to realise that Paratici, knows best, because even myself, some of the signings he made in the last summer were, in my view, quite questionable. But I think there's a clear structure in place now, and I think Spurs are really reaping the rewards of bringing that extra support in between the manager and Levy.
I was going to ask Ryan, he's been at the club now for just over a year. How would you assess his time at Spurs? Because the signings that he's made this summer, of course, the fans are extremely happy with. When you look back at the January transfer window, those couple of signings that come in have done extremely well, hit the ground running. This guy just seems to be a workaholic and just doesn't stop working, does he?
Exactly. And I think, from a supporter's perspective, I can't vouch for Tottenham fans, but at the same time, that's all you want to see your club doing, is showing ambition and really putting the feelers out there. And, even if, some stuff doesn't come off, there's movement, there's activity. And we've seen so many times in the past few weeks, players linked with Tottenham. And, even when you were going for Bastoni, I know it didn't come off, but there was clear targets and you felt like there was forward planning. And, from the indications that are kind of out there, Paratici didn't really stop when the season finished. He carried on and really wanted to help gain that ground on the other sides above Spurs last season. And I do think, you know, in the modern transfer window, having a director as such as a Paratici who can really drive the business is you know, a luxury to some extent. But when he's got that network of contacts, you know, you look at some of the players they target in Italy, even I know they're not concrete links, but players like Gianluca Scamacca and players like that I've seen Tottenham loosely linked with. You know, there's no one better probably in world football than Paratici to really, you know, he knows Serie A like the back of his hand, and players like Gleison, Bremer as well. I know his stock's risen quite considerably in the past season or so, but you know, they're the kind of players that Tottenham are already hot on, and you know, teams like Manchester United at the moment and you know, don't really seem to be looking at these kind of players, whereas Paratici is already all over them.
What's the chances, Ryan, of Spurs actually signing one of those who you mentioned, Bastoni, Gvardiol was another one? What's the chance of actually getting one of them over the line? Because, of course, Bastoni's agent has come out and said that, you know, they want to honour the contract and he wants to stay at Inter Milan. Do you think he can be turned and could possibly sign for Spurs this summer?
Ultimately, the key, Chris, is with Inter Milan, and because, as we know, it's well documented, they need to generate some cash for a sale to clear some of their financial struggles. The one that they would push towards the door is Milan Skriniar, who is obviously a player that Tottenham have been interested in the past. I know Steve Hitchin went to Milan, I think it was August 2020 or it might have been towards the end of the transfer window, to try and work on that deal, but it didn't quite come off for Spurs. I know Paris Saint-Germain are in talks to sign him at the moment. And obviously following that meeting with Bastoni's agent, there was clear communication that he'd be staying. But the key would be, you know, if they cannot find a buyer for Skriniar, they cannot agree a deal with PSG. And if there is financial pressure to sell, then ultimately it's one that they might look to push towards the door. I think Inter are confident within themselves that they can replace players, as we've seen with Lukaku and Hakimi. You know, when they left, that was two integral parts of a title-winning dressing room. But ultimately, Dumfries came in, and even Dzeko, as a veteran, came in and seemingly replaced Lukaku. So I don't think Inter are too caught up on losing any of their best players. But ultimately, you know, it has been agreed with Bastoni as a sort of gentleman's agreement as such that he'll be staying. And also, I think it depends on Conte, because I've touched upon this before in some of my videos, but if you rewind the clock to that defeat to Burnley when Conte looked to be on the brink, it just shows how quickly, with his sort of domineering character, things can change.
Yeah.
You know, at the moment, it's all, you know, positive and upbeat at Tottenham. But, you know, say, for instance, there was a difficult start to the season. You know, Conte is such an unpredictable character that, you know, you wouldn't be surprised if it ends in tears. And I think for Bastoni,
I don't want to hear that one.
I know. I've had a lot of you know, criticism from Spurs fans over that kind of line of thinking, but I still just think with Conte and his history, you know, for someone like Bastoni to commit to Spurs, it would be to work with Conte. So you know, he might want to just assess how the next season plays out, and you know, if Tottenham continue to make strides like they're doing, then I do think it's a deal that can be struck in the future.
In all seriousness, with that you're saying about Conte, do you expect Conte to sign an extension of his own contract? Because, you know, Spurs are clearly backing this manager. You know, in the last couple of months, any guests that come on this channel, I always said to them, what is the definition of backing Antonio Conte? This is it, isn't it?
Yes, I think this is all Conte would have wanted when they all sat down with the board at the end of the season. I think obviously they would have outlined plans to go after ex-players and stuff, but he's received the cash injection from the owners, and they're showing ambition in the market. And ultimately, you know, if you look at the teams around Spurs, I think quite frankly any of them would snap your hand off for the transfer window that Tottenham have had so far. And you know, there's still the best part of 2 months almost to go. So, you know, who knows what Tottenham could do in the remaining few months. And there's indications that they won't be stopping here, and they'll be continuing to press on. So I think all the while the backing is there, and all the while the likes of Harry Kane and Son want to stay, You know, you've got a fantastic stadium. If Spurs are performing on the field, then Conte has no reason to leave. And although, you know, he's a manager that doesn't tend to stick around, I think if you keep him happy and satisfied, I do believe he'll show that loyalty.
Do you think that we will see him sign a new contract, though, at the very start of the season?
I'm still a little bit sceptical, but it's obviously a possibility. You know, if he receives assurances that this is how things are going to continue from here on in, and he has everything, you know, a manager would want to build a successful team. And, you know, I think personally, what I find attractive about the Spurs at the Spurs job at the moment is it's a project. It's not one where success is, you know, guaranteed, or it's not one where there's still a lot of work to do. But I think that's the exciting thing about it. And, you know, keeping the likes of Kane and Son, and I really feel like there's a great platform from last season to build on now. And, you know, I think only Conte will know if he's ready to commit to it. But, you know, on the basis of what we've seen, there's no reason why he wouldn't, because he's receiving everything he wants.
Ryan, before we talk about Clement Lenglet and Djed Spence, are Tottenham linked with anybody else at the moment? Any close signings?
Nothing close at the moment. Obviously, as we've learned this transfer window, particularly, you know, things can change within an hour or so. But at the moment, it is very much the focus is on Clement Lenglet and Djed Spence. There's a few targets in the background that are being monitored. I think the signing of a number 10, which can provide the flexibility to switch from a 3-4-3 to a 3-5-2 or 3-4-1-2, if you like, with that attacking midfielder, someone of the Eriksen mould. I know Jesse Lingard is obviously one that's been linked in the past few days, but I expect him to join West Ham. I do think that's one they will certainly look at, a player that gives them that ability to switch to a 2 up front, which is obviously, as we talked about, where Richarlison could come into play, where Son, you know, features centrally. So it's about having that flexibility in that squad. But ultimately, I think Spurs are focused on the 2 we mentioned, and then it will be a case of what happens with outgoings first.
And you mentioned earlier to me off air about Spurs were looking at a player for the future.
Yes, that's Red Bull Salzburg's 19-year-old forward Benjamin Sesko. When I put the story out, there was quite a few Football Manager fans who were sort of all over that, because he's a player with ridiculously good potential. As we've seen with the Salzburg conveyor belt, you know, they're no strangers to producing top talent. We've seen Erling Haaland, Takumi Minamino, Dominic Szoboszlai, Sadio Mane, Karim Adeyemi, who's joined Dortmund. The list goes on. So I think Salzburg is one of those teams that are just naturally so good at producing talent, and Sesko looks like the next in line. From what I understand, Paratici is one of the many interested parties in a deal for Sesko. His agent has also just met with Paolo Maldini, who discussed his interest in signing him. So I think once we see a full season this year at Salzburg, I think we could see him potentially move to a European giant next summer, and Spurs are certainly making checks on him at the moment.
Okay, thanks for that. What is the latest on Djed Spence? Because this transfer seems to be dragging on. Do you think that Tottenham will get this one over the line? You know, when you think about it, Antonio Conte and the players will be getting on the plane to South Korea on Saturday. Will this be done before that date?
You throw me under pressure now, Chris. But to be honest, I'm always confident. I've always said from Spence, you know, from the people that I've spoke to and with knowledge of the situation, I've always been confident, and I still remain confident that he will be a Tottenham player. And there's several reasons for that, and I'll explain why. One of which is Spurs have Champions League football, and the other clubs that are currently interested in signing him cannot offer that. Secondly, Forest are now exploring other targets. They're resigned to the fact that, you know, Spence wants to join Tottenham. You know, if you put yourself in the player's position as a 21-year-old, you're looking at a team who play in London, which is where Spence came through the ranks at Fulham. They've got the best stadium in the world. They've got Champions League football. They play a system that complements your style as a wing back. You know, it's a perfect fit. You know, if a team played a 4 at the back, you know, Spence isn't quite the same player in that situation. You've got you know, players like Harry Kane and Heung-min Son that you can potentially link up with. And, you know, he's not going to cost an extortionate fee. So, you know, from my perspective, all the signs are pointing towards Tottenham getting the deal done. I was expecting them to make a bid following the conclusion of the international break when Spence played for England under 21s. I think he scored an own goal against Slovenia. And following the conclusion of that, I was told that Tottenham were ready to make an offer. But that offer was, you know, pretty lowball, to be honest. It's understood to be around £10 million with no add-ons, whereas Middlesbrough are looking for at least 15 million plus 5 million in add-ons. And I wrote about this in my column this morning that Borough are keen to push through the sale now because ultimately the funds they get from Spence will be used towards a promotion push. There's several targets that they want to pursue, but they can't quite do that at the moment because the money's not there. Wilder's resigned to losing Spence, but at the same time, you know, if Tottenham don't pay what is required, then he would be happy to keep him or potentially explore selling him elsewhere. So I think Spurs are relaxed on Spence, although, as you mentioned, you know, the South Korea, Tottenham will want to get all their targets there for the tour. I don't think there's any pressure on it or any stress. I think it's one Tottenham are really relaxed about. You know, all the other clubs that have shown of interest, they can't really compete with what Tottenham are prepared to, you know, have as part of their proposal in terms of their package and the sell of the club. But ultimately, it could rest with how patient Borough are prepared to be. And, you know, as the sign suggests, they're losing patience. So that could leave the door open for someone else to wrap it up. But I really think, you know, Spence will be a Tottenham player.
Right. If that deal doesn't get over the line, are Spurs looking at any other right backs? Do you know?
There was Nordi Mukiele from Leipzig, who's a player that's been looked at in the past, but I would probably say he would be more likely to feature at right centre back. He's not really a wing back as such, although he has played there for Leipzig. He usually plays in a back four. So Mukiele is one they would probably look at. He's one that was targeted previously under Jose Mourinho. But I think, you know, from what we can see in the media, I saw the comments from Emerson Royale's agent that Conte doesn't want to sell him at any cost. It's obviously been interest from Atletico Madrid and Roma. But I think Tottenham would be happy to probably, I know it's probably not what the fans want to hear, but I think they'd be quite comfortable to maybe give it another go with Royale and Doherty once he returns. I think, you know, to Emerson's credit, he finished the season quite impressively, really. So, but then again, you know, the money's there to spend. So if they see another target and there's one that can be worked on, then no, I wouldn't rule out an alternative move. But as I mentioned, you know, I'm quite confident that Spence will join Spurs.
That's one thing that Antonio Conte is extremely good at, isn't it? And I don't think a lot of Spurs fans are worried in that regard, because you know that if a player, you know, if a player isn't playing his best, Antonio Conte will always improve that player and get the best out of them, as he showed last season.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, Conte is very much a man who can turn trash into treasure. And I don't mean that disrespectfully to any players individually, but if you just look at what he done with Victor Moses, he was, you know, essentially passed around on loan to several Premier League clubs. And, you know, Ashley Young, who was a spare part at Manchester United and seemingly, you know, on the verge of retirement, he turned them into, you know, two phenomenal wing backs at Inter. So I do think Conte has that effect, and that's why I'd put trust in any signing that is made by Tottenham. You know, even though it might not look on paper like a sexy signing as such, you know, you trust in the club to that he'll get the best from them and improve players. I mean, even if you look at this season, some of the improvements some of the players have made, even the likes of you know, Eric Dyer, I look at him now and I think, you know, he should be in the England squad. He's like a new signing, and I know he's had several of those stages under Poch and Mourinho, but you know, I think it's clear how highly he's rated by Conte now, and I think that will be the same case with several other players within the squad.
Yeah, certainly huge improvement in Ben Davies last season as well. That brings me on nicely to speak about Clement Lenglet. Reports a couple of weeks ago were stating that Clement Lenglet was about to join Spurs on a 2-year loan deal from Barcelona. Recent reports are stating that it's going to be a 12-month loan deal. Do you have any latest information on the Clement Lenglet situation?
Yeah, you're right. It was initially looking like a 2-year deal because Lenglet has effectively been told by Barcelona he's free to find another club. And that saw him offered around to a number of clubs earlier in the window, including Spurs, Arsenal and Juventus. But Tottenham didn't really jump at the chance to sign him. But, given what's happened with Bastoni and the lack of left-sided centre-backs available on the market, actually, if you look at them, even yourself, I've done it myself, Lenglet is actually up there with the most attractive options, which, to some is not particularly inspiring. But ultimately, I think he ticks a lot of boxes. And I think if he's to sign on a 1-year loan deal with an option to buy, that really does buy Spurs some extra time to see what other options become available within the next year, which players come to. We've seen even the likes of Sven Botman and Gvardiol. But a couple of years ago, they weren't really players that were held in high regard. They're developing, and I think we'll probably see next season new players that we haven't really heard that much of this summer develop. So it really gives Spurs a good bargaining position to, if Lenglet's good, we'll sign him permanently. Why not? He's a good age, 27 at the moment, France international, 15 caps, big game experience with Barcelona. If not, we'll move on to targets. And, Bastoni might be available in 12 months' time. You don't really know.
Would you expect Lenglet to get a lot of game time at Tottenham under Conte and just rotate with the likes of Ben Davies?
Yes, but I think, I know Spurs, it's well documented that Spurs are targeting a left-sided centre-back, but I think Conte loves Ben Davies. And, if you look at his performance with Wales against Ukraine in the World Cup playoff, I'm not the biggest fan of Ben Davies, but on that left-sided centre-back of a back three, he looks like a different player to a left-back. He's not that, mobile as such, but the way he reads the game, his blocks, his tackles, I think he's a real asset to Spurs at the moment, and I'd probably expect him to look at signing a new contract. So I think it'll be a case of rotation. I think Lenglet will probably be given minutes, but, it's so important for Spurs to compete on all fronts. You need a competitive squad, and Conte's track record in the Champions League isn't that great. So I think the key to sort of changing that is having that depth where you can willingly rotate, where it doesn't actually affect the quality of the side. And I think Lenglet would provide that.
Ryan, we know Antonio Conte is a league manager. He's won leagues everywhere he's gone. What do you think Tottenham need from now until the end of the window to really compete for the Premier League with the likes of Manchester City and Liverpool?
It's a good question. I think, ultimately they just need to continue this trend of signing targets that are specifically tailored for their requirements and their needs. I think ultimately a top class centre back and a creative midfielder that can play in that number 10 role that offers the flicks, the change in formation I think that would be the ultimate way to bridge that gap and certainly put the pressure on. I think the key really for Spurs is keeping everyone fit, which is obviously something that's completely out of your hands sometimes. We've seen some of as I mentioned earlier in the show, the injuries Kane's had have been so unfortunate. But if you can keep him fit and firing, ultimately, he's as good as anyone in the league. Simple as that, really. And it will just be a case of strengthening the current options. And I think two top class additions plus Spence and Lenglet. I still think Spurs just need that commanding. I know Romero's excellent, and obviously he'll be starting next season. But I think one more at the back could really, if Spurs tighten up that defence to the point where they're conceding minimal goals, Spurs on their day are going to score goals, and I think it's that simple. So that would be the focus from my perspective. But sometimes in terms of title races and stuff, it can be out of your hands. If you look at the Premier League now compared to the year Leicester won it, you need like 95 plus points to have a chance of winning the league. And I just think ultimately that is a difficult ask. You know, some of the Spurs sides in recent years, you know, would have been good enough to win the Premier League on some days. So in some seasons, so sometimes you need a bit of fortune. You maybe need City and Liverpool to drop their standards, and Tottenham to have the best season they've had in, you know, Premier League history maybe. But there's no reason why you can't dream.
So you don't think I am dreaming?
To be honest, like from my perspective, I do, you know, sometimes it doesn't always go how everyone thinks, especially when you sign a lot of new players. But, you know, from the outside looking in, I'm looking at Spurs, and, you know, there's not much to suggest that they'll struggle next season. And, you know, on the basis of some of those performances towards the end of last season, it shows they're as good as anyone in the league. You know, they more than matched Liverpool that day at Anfield when they had a draw. Could easily have won that game. You know, they beat City away and played an absolutely unbelievable game. The 3-2 win at the Etihad. And, you know, it's just about that consistency for Spurs. You know, they can beat one of the best teams in the Premier League, but then the next week they'll go and lose, you know, 1-0 to Southampton or Burnley. So it's just about kind of straightening out those tiny dips in their season that I always remember when Conte arrived and he said, my team, I want them to be a team that, I can't remember what he said, but he said like something like consistency, not win one, lose one. And that's kind of what was happening at times. He was like, no wobbles, just like, you know, it might be a draw, but it'll be 3 wins after that.
I think it was, if we can't win the game, we are not to lose it.
Exactly, something like that. And, you know, over time, those draws, they do add up the points, especially at the end of the season. You know, you look at pretty much every top 4 race, it's always down to a point at the end of the season or this and that. And, you know, some of the cheap losses Spurs have thrown away, certainly in recent years, you know, against lower sides, if you can, you know, straighten out those, then they certainly have a chance of dreaming and being a 3rd horse in a 2-horse race.
Surely though, Ryan, if anyone's going to change that mentality and that's going to be shifted, it's got to be Antonio Conte. And I say this a lot on this channel as well. You go from Mauricio Pochettino to Jose Mourinho to Antonio Conte. How can you not win a trophy under those 3, you know, quality managers? Do you think Antonio Conte is going to be successful at Spurs?
Yes, I do. I just think Conte has been successful everywhere he's been. So I think he's got all the tools he needs. You know, it might not be. It depends what, you know, you're defining as success. Is a Carabao Cup a success? I think so, personally. You know, I know there was a lot judged on Pochettino's inability to win a trophy, and people were saying, you know, if he wins the Carabao Cup, what's effectively the difference? You know, it's not a top class trophy, but, you know, from my perspective, I think solidifying Spurs as a Champions League side again and winning a cup competition would be tremendous success for Tottenham. Certainly in an age where, you know, like I said, City and Liverpool were setting the benchmark at 93, 95 points every season. You know, it's so difficult to topple that. You literally have to have everything with you and hope that, you know, they're not on their game. And, you know, sometimes that's out of your control. So I do think Conte has the ability to win trophies, and I think he's already transforming the whole mentality of the club.
Right, with the 4 confirmed signings, if we get the 2 over the line in Clement Lenglet and Djed Spence, that'll be 6. How many more beyond that do you think, if I was to ask you for a prediction, how many more beyond that do you think the Spurs will sign before the 1st of September?
I think 2. I don't know. I know a creative midfielder will certainly be one that they look at. Someone who can play as a number 10 that can switch to that system, as I mentioned. It's something that Conte done at Inter Milan with Christian Eriksen. It's a signing that changed them to a 3-5-2. That is ultimately the formation Conte has favoured in recent years, particularly with Inter, 2 up front. So it's one he'll be looking to add to Spurs' armour, really. And then it would just be a case of, like I said, maybe looking at what players depart. You know, you look at players like Reguilon, Emerson Royale. You know, there's no guarantees are going to be at the club. Joe Rodon as well. They might need an extra centre back just to provide that extra cover. I do think it's one of those situations that is fluid. It's not something at the moment where Spurs will be set in stone and think we only want these two positions. I think they're very open-minded, and when you have, a case where you've got the crux of the business over the line, it's such a good position to be in. So much freedom, Effectively, if the transfer window ended here, Tottenham fans, wouldn't have too many complaints. They'd obviously want to see him go for more signings, but I think effectively if Spence and Lenglet arrive, I think that's an 8 out of 10 plus window, potentially more than that. So, it's the world's their oyster, effectively.
Well, I think the creative midfielder side of things is a real key, and I think that Spurs definitely need to sign a creative midfielder. Ryan, are you hearing anything that Spurs could possibly sign a player with Premier League experience within the Premier League at the moment? Are there any links anywhere?
Yes, there's Jesse Lingard, as we touched upon, which is an interesting one because Spurs actually reached out to his representatives in January to hold, basic discussions over his situation at Manchester United. He came close to joining Newcastle, but the brakes were kind of put on that, which was strange because he barely featured, in the second half of the season, which feels like a waste given, how effective Lingard was at West Ham, for example. I think he scored 9 goals and got 4 assists in about 14 to 15 games, which is, those kind of numbers are ridiculous, really, for a creative midfielder. And I know Lingard isn't one that will potentially excite Tottenham fans because, he's kind of that Dele Alli mould where he's either going to be hit or miss. He's either going to set the world alight or he'll be, dreadful as such. And I'm quite surprised Tottenham weren't more serious about Eriksen. I don't know if it was the figures involved, that's just me speculating. But from the outside looking in, he's a player that loves the club, wants to stay in London, obviously has a great affiliation to Spurs from his time at the club previously. He's played under Conte before. He's played with Kane. He's got a great relationship with Kane and Son. All the signs were there to suggest that deal would have been there to be done. So I don't know if there's other targets that Tottenham have their eye on. But at the moment, I'm not actually aware of any. But we do expect, movement on that front because, as we mentioned, it's a position of such priority to Tottenham now that the majority of their business is done.
Ryan, I completely agree with you on the Christian Eriksen thing. But a lot of viewers and listeners don't agree. Spurs fans, they didn't want him back, but I certainly did. Let's talk about Spurs flying to South Korea on Saturday. Now, the big thing for me and the big question for me is who gets on the plane, who doesn't get on the plane, because lots of speculation about the likes of Tanguy Ndombele, Giovanni Lo Celso, Brian Hill, Joe Rodon, who you mentioned, Harry Winks, Sergio Reguilon, Jack Clark, players like this. For you, when does that decision get made? Or do you think the decision has already been made? Is it Antonio Conte that decides that? Or does he have to take these players to put some of them in the shop window? Today, Tanguy Ndombele came out and said, I just want to be happy. Is he going to be happy getting on that plane?
I think ultimately it will hinge on, there'll be a few factors. One will be the condition they've returned to Spurs in, the mentality. Is Ndombele ready to fight for his place, or is he kind of just rocking up and being relaxed about it? Has he got that hunger to turn things around? As a player that costs £55 million and that just about every Spurs fan adores when he's at the top of his game, or is it going to be that lazy player that doesn't look too interested, isn't too motivated to perform at the top of his game? I think in the cases of everyone as a whole, those players you mentioned, the likes of Rodon, Brian Hill, who has loan interest from Sampdoria and Marseille, I think it will be a case of what proposals and what stage talks are currently at with, potential buyers. Yeah. I feel like, it's pretty much common sense that you're not going to send a player to the other side of the world when, they're on the verge of a transfer. We only have to look at Cristiano Ronaldo with United set to jet off on Friday. Because his future is uncertain, it doesn't look like he's going to commit to doing that. I remember Lukaku, when he left United, flew to Australia with them and then had to come back. So I think it will be a case of which players are, what stage of negotiations. If there's not a concrete offer or certainly indication within talks that, you know, a deal was going to be close. And I think they'll travel. I think Conte is a manager that sets standards and, you know, demands that maximum and will, you know, certainly look to keep all the options, you know, available at hand, seeing what players he can work with and how they improve within the next few weeks. But yeah, I don't really see a case of, unless there is genuinely a player that is on the verge of an exit, which sometimes there are transfers that we, you know, aren't reported and materialise quite quickly. Unless that is the case, and I do expect Spurs to sort of that flight to be full to the brim, to be honest with you.
So you expect Ndombele and Lo Celso to be on that plane?
I mean, I don't want to make predictions, but, you know, Lo Celso is a complicated one because Villarreal would like to sign him on a permanent basis, but they didn't qualify for the Champions League or Europa League, which is really sort of hindered their spending power. That's why, you know, they're so keen to sell on at Danjuma. Obviously, there was negotiations with West Ham, but that deal was since sort of broken down for a number of reasons. But the Lo Celso deal would have been one they would have been open to if Danjuma was sold. I still think he's a player of interest, but it would be a case of convincing Tottenham to reduce their asking price and getting kind of a cut price deal on that front. You know, I don't see Ndombele and Lo Celso turning things around at Tottenham. I would like to see him do so because I think on their day, both of them are, you know, I was a big fan of Lo Celso at Betis and Ndombele, you know, we've all seen when he turns up how good he can be. And I think Spurs in midfield, you know, I know we've talked about how good the options are now with Basuma and Bentancur, but both of them provide something different. Lo Celso could be that number 10. So could Ndombele to some extent, but Ndombele is that player that when there's deep defences and stuff, he's got that bit of magic to unlock the door, and so it'll be ultimately be up to the players and ultimately be down to which proposals arrive, what kind of money's offered to Tottenham. I do think they'll be keen to offload both of those though.
I think it's very fair to say, Ryan, when Antonio Conte come in early November, having taken over from Nuno Espirito Santo, he gave every single player in the squad a chance, and a fair chance at that. Tonga Ndombele clearly didn't take that chance. Do you think that Antonio Conte will possibly give people like Tonga Ndombele and Giovanni Lo Celso another chance in a Spurs shirt if there is no interest in this summer? Because when you look at how much money these two cost, £100 million between the two of them, and Spurs, you know, quite often, you know, in previous years have been heavily criticised about not spending money. £100 million between these two. Do you think that they could ever feature in a Spurs shirt under Conte again?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't see why not. I know Conte is kind of someone who is quite stubborn in the way he operates. Now, I remember when Diego Costa was told months after winning Chelsea the Premier League title that he was free to find a new club and he wasn't in Conte's plans. You know, he's that kind of savage. But I think, you know, if they are showing that hunger and desire to turn things around in the sessions that are currently going on at Hotspur Way, you know, with view to potential South Korea if they do go out there, I don't see any reason why they can't turn things around. You know, I think Daniel Levy will be keen for one to maximise the money that they sell the players for, but you know he forked out big cash on both of them, like you mentioned, and he will try and encourage Conte to kind of find that player within them and you know avoid making Spurs huge losses financially. So there's no reason why not. I don't think, you know, it would be encouraged from within the boardroom for Conte to let them rot in the reserves when their value would be constantly decreasing. You know, if you look at Ndombele when he signed for Tottenham in that opening game against Villa, I think it was. If you look at now the fact he went back on loan to Lyon and they weren't even remotely interested in signing him permanently, you know, it's quite a fall from grace, really. So if there's any way they can kind of find that revival and that fire with inside either player, I think they will certainly look to do it. Particularly, as I mentioned, you know, the interesting element about the fact Spurs need a number 10, and you know both of those can play those roles. So you know it might be an outside option that materialises.
Well, we got here we go from Fabrizio Romano earlier on the Steven Bergwijn deal to Ajax for 30 million euros. Is there any other interest, Ryan, for some of these players? You know, because there's been lots of speculation about a lot of these players leaving Spurs, in particular Harry Winks. Everton and Leeds apparently registered an interest. Is there any truth in that? And what is the latest on Harry Winks?
Harry Winks is an interesting one because Everton approached Tottenham about a permanent deal to sign him. There was also loose talks about the prospect of him being included in the Richarlison deal. But at the moment, it looks like Everton have kind of taken a backseat and they're looking at pursuing alternative targets. I think the kind of figures that Tottenham were looking for initially were sort of within the region of £25 million. I think now there's an acceptance that sort of 20 or close to that figure would be an acceptable offer. I think there is interest in other Spurs players as well. As I mentioned, Emerson Royal, Atletico Madrid have made a loan with permanent view offer for him. But at the moment, Spurs don't really feel the need to weaken their options when they haven't even got Spence. I know Joe Rodon is a player that Forest have looked at. There's also other Premier League clubs that could enter the fray for him. I know Davinson Sanchez is an interesting one as well because, you know, you still feel like deep down there is a very decent defender in there, but see, he's still so prone to an error and a calamity. And you know, if it's not happening for him now under Conte, you do expect him to move on. And then Monaco and Sevilla have showed interest in him as well. And then also there's Brian Hill, which is Sampdoria, Marseille among the clubs to look at signing him on loan. At the moment, it looks like Tottenham will probably look to see what happens with other players within their squad before they make a decision on that. I know Lucas Moura is looking out to see the final 2 years of his contract out at Spurs as well. So, you know, there's a lot of these players within the fringes of the squad that, you know, if the money's right, they would potentially move on, and that would give, you know, Tottenham a bit more leverage to look at some more fringe players.
Brian, what do you think will happen to the likes of Troy Parrott? Of course, last season spent the season on loan at MK Dons, and then you've got youngsters like Alfie Devine and Dane Scarlett, who of course have just won the Euro Championship with the under-19s. Do you think they will get much game time, or would you expect all three of them, or possibly one or two of them, to go out on loan?
I think that would be the plan for Spurs. I think they'll be open to listening to what offers arrive, and with these kind of players, you know, there's always strong interest from EFL clubs and Championship clubs. I think for someone like Scarlett, that is the perfect move now. I think everyone knows that he is a serious, prospect. It's just about kind of nurturing that now. I'm not sure if you're aware of Cameron Archer from Villa, but for me, he's one that has shown already that, if you're good enough, then you'll make your mark on loan. He went to Preston in the second half of last season. He looks, a really top striker. And I think if Scarlett was to go out and get some senior minutes and hit the ground running and scoring goals, then it would certainly fast track his way into the Spurs first team. Same applies to Parrott, really. I know he's quite a frustrating player. Didn't quite happen for him at Millwall. Then he went to MK Dons, and he's starting to show now flashes of that quality. And, we saw with Harry Kane, the penny didn't drop with him straight away. So it's just a case of finding the right fit. But I think ultimately regular football is the importance right now. And with Spurs getting Champions League and not Europa League or Conference League, I think the best route for them will be a loan move.
The one name that always comes up when I do these types of streams is James Maddison. Do you think there's any chance that Spurs could put a cheeky bid in for him?
I think that ship may have sailed now, to be honest with you, Chris. He's a player that there'll always be interest in him, not only from Spurs. If you look at his profile, he's English, he's a good age, his productivity in terms of goals and assists, and he's never quite reached that next level. And, maybe a move away from Leicester would help him achieve that. But I think Leicester would demand a premium for Maddison, sort of 50 million upwards. And I don't ultimately think Tottenham have shown the indication and desire that they'd, be prepared to pay that sort of money for Maddison. The same with the likes of Manchester United and Arsenal have also looked at him. So it's an interesting one. I think, if the money's there to finance a move for a playmaker, then he's probably one that would be considered. But I feel like someone like Maddison would have to be like a concrete target that was identified in the early stages of the window, like Richarlison was, for example, in order for Spurs to pay that kind of money.
Ryan, before we talk about England, just wanted to get your opinion on who you think should be on the Tottenham Hotspur free kicks, because Harry Kane seems to be on them. He doesn't score very many. And when you've seen recently Heung-min Son take a couple for South Korea, it looks like he should be on them.
Absolutely. I think, if you get the chance to shoot, you want, they're not bad options to have, of course, but, I think Son's precision in terms of his, even from a dead ball, I've seen some of those South Korea free kicks. I think, he's got to be up there with one of the best finishers on the planet. I know, Kane's one-on-one finishing is next level as well, but, the technique from Son and the precision, which he hits them with power, but into, certain pockets of the goal, I think, certainly Son should be looking to pick that ball up a bit more regularly.
There's a couple of other comments in here, Ryan, saying about James Ward-Prowse and Tielemans. Any chance of Spurs signing them this summer?
Of course, I think those are players that will obviously be of interest to Tottenham, because it's well documented that they've been looked at in previous transfer windows. I still think Tielemans is not really a number 10, to be honest, and neither is Ward-Prowse. They're both number 8s as such. I think Southampton would demand a seriously big fee to agree to sell him Ward-Prowse, but obviously Tielemans, there's a deal there to be done for any club that wants to sign him this summer. He's approaching the final 12 months of his Leicester deal, so if Spurs want him, they can go get him. Particularly given that the information I've received from the Arsenal end is that their interest has indeed cooled. I know there was conflicting kind of suggestions of whether they'd push ahead with that after the Vieira deal, but I was told to not write about Tielemans when it comes to Arsenal anymore, because the interest was never as strong as it has been indicated. So Tottenham, if they wanted to get him, they could certainly push ahead with that.
Right, and lastly, just want to get your thoughts on England at the World Cup in November, of course in Qatar, in our group, Iran, USA and Wales. How do you think England will do in the World Cup, and how strange do you think it will be being played mid-season in the Premier League?
Yeah, I do think I'm still not kind of completely warm to that idea, to be honest. Particularly, say the title race is hot enough, or a big player gets injured, and if you get injuries at the World Cup, it just completely changes the complexity of the season. So I'm really not sure how that's going to work, and you'd expect the season to rumble on a little bit longer than expected, but of course that then affects the next season as well. So there's going to be a lot of kind of negative knock-on effects of the tournament, but nonetheless, a World Cup's a World Cup. We're all going to feast on it. I think in terms of England, looking at that group, you couldn't really have asked for an easier draw, really. But it's important to stamp out that complacency. We know there's work to be done after the last two tournaments. Both tournaments we've had favourable draws, but I think it's all about now the fact there's only 2 more games before the tournament concerns me, given the nature of that result against Hungary. I think Southgate is no closer to knowing his strongest team. We know the crux of it, but I think it'll be pretty similar to the one we saw at the Euros, and ultimately that team hasn't played much together since that competition. So I'm kind of a little bit frustrated that he was experimenting so much in the Nations League games, but I think once it gets to a tournament, I think all of it goes out the window. The team you put out will be among your strongest players. I think it's a completely different mindset and focus. So I'm not getting too caught up on that Hungary result, but that was a real concern.
You mentioned the form of Eric Dyer last season. He was absolutely fantastic for Spurs. Do you think there's any chance that Eric Dyer will be on that plane to Qatar?
Of course. I think, the fact they play a 3 at the back is certainly, a huge benefit to Dyer, of course, who's played such a good role in that Spurs defence. And I think Southgate did name-check Dyer as one of those players that were unfortunate to miss out on. I know it's maybe, hard to take given some of the other players in there. But centre back's certainly a position that's up for grabs. The likes of Tomori. I know Cody isn't. You know, a lot of Tottenham fans find it, you know, crazy that Dyer's not in there over Cody. But you know, I'm a big fan of Cody. I know he's not the greatest and most gifted centre back.
Maguire is more questionable.
Yeah, sorry, Maguire, of course. You know, Maguire. I don't think if he was, you know, an £80 million player, he certainly wouldn't be in that squad on the basis of his performances. So it'll be interesting. You know, if Dyer continues to maintain this kind of level of performance, I think it'll be hard to avoid him. But ultimately, it's probably in his hands, and you know whether Southgate's bold enough to make that kind of decision where he leaves one of his other favourites out.
Ryan, very last question for you. Do you expect Antonio Conte and Tottenham Hotspur Football Club to win a trophy next season?
Are you going to press end on the call if I say no?
I want your honest answer. I want your honest, professional answer.
I don't see why not. I mean, you know, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but, you know, the problem for Tottenham is that they're in an era where City and Liverpool are so good. You know, if that wasn't the case, you know, you could say Tottenham would be almost certain to win a trophy next season. You know, it might only be the Carabao Cup or, you know, the FA Cup, but, you know, a trophy is a trophy. I think Tottenham have got everything they need now to do it. And if they don't, then I think, you know, it's their own sort of issue, really. Although, you know, City and Liverpool are, like I said, at the top of their game. I think, you know, you've got two of the best players in the league in Kane and Son, and you're making signings that are really, you know, showing that you're backing the manager. So all the tools are there, and it's just down to the players and Conte to deliver now.
Well, Ryan, I can't thank you enough for your time, and tell everyone where they can find your YouTube channel and your wonderful work to do with the Daily Express.
Appreciate you asking me on, Chris. I've really enjoyed myself, actually. That hour's flown by. So in terms of my Twitter account is at Ryan Taylor Sport. That's where I do most of, you know, my updates on a day-to-day basis. But you can find my work on the Daily Express website. But my YouTube channel is Taylor Talks Transfers. Hopefully Chris is kind enough to maybe plug it at the bottom of the description. Maybe that might get me a little bit of appreciate that, a little bit of traction. But I'm just starting to build it slowly. You know, hopefully one day I could maybe have a channel as big as this from Chris. It's very impressive, and I've been, you know, very impressed, like I said, with the setup and how he's welcomed me onto the show. So thank you very much, Chris, and I hope you guys have enjoyed it.
We've had a lot of love in the comments, Ryan. I can't thank you enough. You've been a brilliant guest, and hopefully we can have you back on again when Tottenham have won a trophy, or indeed challenge for the Premier League, or even won the Premier League. Wouldn't that be lovely? And I can't wait to read your articles on it either.
No worries.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Sorry, Ryan, what were you going to say?
No, I was just saying, yeah, hopefully, you know, for yourself that is the case. But yeah, I've really enjoyed the show, and I appreciate some of the comments that I can see now. So thanks for listening.
Yep, thanks for watching, everybody. Thanks for listening, and I will see you on another live tomorrow when I've got very special guest Matt Le Tissier on the channel. So that would be an interesting one. So thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next one. Until then, come on, you Spurs.